Chthonian Pleasures was made in 1996, probably a year after Harry and I had stopped working together. And I invited 3 new performers to work with me. And unlike Nolly, which is a very clean, minimal, white floor kind of set, I used the same floor, but I put a big circle of peat on the floor. And that alluded to the underworld, the dirty side of life. I wanted to make a mess for the first time, a physical mess with probably 1.5 tons of peat that we dragged around to venues across the UK. And I think there were some real flaws in the thinking behind what the relationship between the trio, 2 women and a man, were involved in this piece. I don't think I quite knew, I couldn't quite work out what that relationship was. So the piece is a very strong physical duet between Rachel and Lee, and then Rosie sort of out on a limb trying to relate or add something to that duet, and I'm not sure I can even work it out now what I was quite doing. As with a lot of my work, it was very highly visual, and my main concern seemed to be to talk about Camille Paglia's idea that not sex but cruelty is the greatest thing that's driving us. And of course, going back to intercourse, the cruelty of porn or the cruelty of sexual violence has always been in the work. But I sort of wanted to lay it out visually, that you start with a neat circle and you start with neat relationships and you start with order, and then from that order comes a kind of real physical dirty chaos, that we are all in the mire together. And the mire was clouds of soil dust, and looking down on the stage, the space go from clean to dirty, from ordered to disordered, from functional to dysfunctional. This was the first piece of work as Vincent Dance Theatre that I was entirely on the outside as a director, and it was a bit of a lesson, I suppose, that if I'm not in it at this time, because I was less experienced than I am now, I couldn't feel it. And until that point, I'd performed in everything, so I could feel from the inside how to steer the work. And suddenly, I suppose, I was on the outside looking at a much cooler framing of what was going on with 3 performers I hadn't worked with before, who were all great in their own right. But I was struggling, I suppose, to make it make sense emotionally. And as a director, you are managing, with the way I work, people's emotions and their mining of their souls and their personal inputting, as well as the much cooler job, which is to find a structure, to compose the work, to distill, to edit, to cut down, to add to, and to frame the whole thing, and to drive the conceptual idea onwards to get to where I want it to go. And I don't think I managed it actually with this piece, because there was too much chaos in the room that I didn't have the skills then to manage. So although one of the performers in particular was bringing chaos into the room in not a very pleasant way, and the other 2 were reeling from that, as was I don't think I had the skills at that time as a manager of people, performers, to get the best out of everybody. And over 20 years I've learnt to work with that chaos and work with that dissatisfaction and work with that frustration and anger, actually, a lot of the time, to turn it into something positive. The thing that I remember is the emotional chaos of making it. But I imagine that when we made it, we all wrote, we all improvised, we all played with ideas, we all brought our own stuff into the room. And I think the main interdisciplinary aspects of this work were the visual shattering of the space with this mess that we were creating. And for the first time I put aerial work in the work. So there's this sense of hanging over a space, which Rosie started the piece with, circling, looking down into the underworld, into the mire, and Lee, the male performer, ended up stranded up there at the end. So in a way, conceptually, it sort of starts with a woman hanging, looking down, then it plays out the interrelationships again between men and women in quite a cruel, difficult way, and then the male is stranded at the end. So in a way, I suppose Chthonian Pleasures was a comment on sometimes you just can't get it right. You can't find the connection between men and women. You can't. You're missing each other. You're both stranded. There's a disconnect. There's a hanging above, looking down, or a being in the mess, looking up, not knowing how to get out of it. And that really is what the show, that particular production, was about. The mess, really. I'm not sure it ended very well, and I didn't work with those 3 performers again, although Rachel is now on my board and in fact did work with me probably 10 years later. She's a brilliant performer. I think, the legacy of that work is my lack of management of emotional chaos in a room, which, as I said, I've now become more skilled in managing, but also the learning curve of what it means to be on the outside. And you can have all sorts of ideas as a director and conceptualise things, but if the people that you're working with, I suppose, can't quite get hold of what you're aiming at, or the material that you generate doesn't function, or the relationships in the room don't function, then you don't achieve what you in your head as a director have mapped out. And it's also just about a bond, which I do have with Rachel now, but I went on to find with T.C. Howard. Moving forward from Chthonian Pleasures, I think I got a sort of little mini, I don't know what they called it, a little mini fellowship or a mini scholarship to go and work as basically a runner on a film with VTOL Dance Company, choreographed by Mark Murphy. And I essentially painted things black and bought cigarettes for Mark for a couple of weeks in, I think it was Elstree Studios, while they were shooting a film. But in that film was a performer called T.C. Howard, who just blew me away. She was dynamite. And shortly after that, seeing her operate in that choreographic situation, I asked her if she wanted to do some work with me. And she did. So we went on to do a research project really called In Optimo City, the Almost Perfect Town, which we performed a few times, which continued an aerial theme, but was just the beginning of a very long-term collaboration with TC.